Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Claire Robinson. I'm the Customer Relationship Manager here at KRC. Thank you all for joining us for the 7th of our Agile webinars, which is all about how to get well-written requirements and user stories from your business analysts. Previous webinars have covered understanding the basics of Agile, how to engage with the business or customer more effectively, facilitation, modelling, combining Agile with PRINCE2, and last month we looked at Scrum. If you've missed any of these webinars, you can still view the recordings or you can download the slides that accompany them. Just visit our website, AgileKRC.com, and click on Resources on the main menu. Next month's webinar will take place on the 12th of October at the same time, and we'll be looking at estimation. So if you go onto AgileKRC.com again, click on Resources, there's also a tab on there for webinars where you'll be able to sign up for the next webinar and you can view all the previous webinar archive. So I'm shortly going to pass you over to your presenter, Keith Richards, but just before I do, I just want to point out a couple of the features of the control panel, just in case this is your first time using this software. So if you look at the top right-hand side of your screen, you'll see an orange box with a white arrow inside. You can click on this to maximize or minimize your control panel. If you'd like to ask a question, just type your question into the question box and Keith will take these at the end. So I'll now pass you over to your presenter, Keith Richards.
Thank you very much there, Claire, and welcome again to a lot of people that have turned up before, and we've got plenty of new ones as well. Just to name check a few countries to give you an idea of where everybody's coming from. I appreciate that some people might be fast asleep at the moment, or very early or very late. But we've got, I think the furthest afield we got is people in the United States. We've got people from Thailand, Brazil, and quite a few from Germany in today. Don't know quite why. Maybe someone could put a message in a chat box there, but a lot of people from Germany in today, and we've got some people from York and also from sunny Bristol. So let's get going with the presentation and looking at how to get well-written requirements and user stories. And before I go any further, I just want to say that as an organisation, and we spend a lot of time going into companies helping them with agile transitions, we find that the role of the business analyst is sometimes quite, I would say, jaw-dropping or very surprising. Sometimes they don't exist. The whole requirements process is done by, for example, software developers or engineers. And other places we go, we find how they've harnessed the business analysts, and we try and retune them slightly and train them in the more agile concepts. And we find this an extremely powerful and effective way of getting your organisation to have successful projects or product delivery. But the reason I'm dwelling on this slightly is we do find this a massive area, and also an area where organisations seem to make, or quite a few, make a big mistake in this area by not really addressing the BA issue, if you like, or the BA role. So let's move on to just the general structure. We'll go through some quick basics, and we'll talk about the reality and why this BA role is so important, and why we at KRC try and major on this when we're helping organisations try and improve how they work. We're going to go in the meat of the presentation to 7 what I'm calling top tips for writing good requirements. I'm sure there's another 7 or another 20, but it's the 7 that I want to highlight that we actually see from our practical experiences of going into companies and helping them with writing requirements. I'm just going to show you one classic user story, something I had from a customer once, which hopefully you'll find quite funny, I don't know. And we'll end with just a little bit of further information. With these webinars, we don't tend to go heavy on the commercials. There's lots of information you can get from those slides if you need them. But what I want to do at the end is to get into a 10 or maybe 15-minute Q&A session at the end. So feel free to start putting across some questions, certainly towards the end of the webinar, and we'll see how much of that I can address for you. So first one, very quick introduction, just so you know about KRC and where we've come from. We're very much a pioneering training and consultancy company. We've been doing Agile for 15 years now. In the last 2 or 3 years it's become extremely busy. It's becoming centre stage, but we've been doing it for ages, so we can sort of stop you making the classic mistakes, if you like. And we specialise across the whole area of Agile. We don't just specialise on 1 or 2 things. We're very interested in moving into what we call Agile at scale, and that is running Agile in larger context, not just 5 people in a room. We try to get organisations of several thousand to use Agile. That's what we specialise in. I personally have been spending a lot of time in Agile, wide range of business analysis experience. Also the author of a book called Agile Project Management, and I was very pleased to be voted Most Valuable Agile Player at the recent UK Agile Awards. Now let's get into the teeth of the presentation and have a look at the basics. Now firstly, with Agile, what we've got to realise is there's a different way of working. When it comes to requirements gathering, the context that we're going to be in is different to traditional way of working. A lot of the time, and it shouldn't really be happening nowadays, but actually is, the BA would come in for 2 or 3 weeks at the beginning of a project, do a sort of laying on of hands exercise, and then disappear. Hopefully no one's doing that anymore, although we still see symptoms of it and perhaps other manifestations of it. But with Agile, what you've got is a very iterative and incremental process, and therefore the BA has got to be engaged throughout. Managing scope is one of the key things about Agile. So if we're managing the scope, trading requirements in, trading requirements out, we can't really afford to have a sort of here today, gone tomorrow BA. There's different demands in an Agile environment. New techniques have come about, new language, and often when we try to talk to the beginners in the Agile space, they come to us saying, what's a burn down chart, what's a user story, this estimation game thing, what's all that about? But several new techniques have come up with Agile. Ironically, you can still use them in traditional ways. They're not just the sort of the wholly owned property of Agile. They're sort of new techniques that I now see as best practice. And we're going to talk about user stories because I think it's one thing that's come out of the Agile wave that I think has a lot of merit and provides a lot of value. If you're going to be Agile, you do need certain conditions. That first word there on that bullet called collaboration, I think is a huge thing. If you've got an adversarial relationship or an us and them in a customer-supplier relationship, Agile doesn't function very well at all, and in fact might be quite dangerous. But if you're getting into things like prioritization, engaging with the business, we're going to need someone who's going to facilitate this, and this is where the BA, they might not be able to do everything, but this is why the BA is such a pivotal role here, and that's why we need them to come to the fore. To not have a BA when you're rolling out Agile into large organizations is quite a dangerous situation to be in. Now, on your registration question, we asked how many people have that sort of role and how many don't. And not really surprisingly, but just to let everybody know what the figure was, just about bang on 3/4 of the people listening to this webinar and have registered have a BA role, but 25% don't. Now, we'll talk about what you might have instead, because it's possibly something called product owner, and we'll come to that later on. But just to let you know that answering that question, 3/4 were very much into the BA role, which is good news. So the one big technique that's come out of Agile in the BA space is this thing called a user story. And what I'm seeing in my travels and what our consultants are seeing is everybody's going around, they've got a user story, and things are just looking good. If you like, sort of job done. We've got a user story, we've got a structure, all we've got to do is fill in the blanks. So the standard, most simplistic user story structure is what you can see on the screen there. As a role, I want to action or function so that benefit. And if you want to make that as simple as possible, and at KRC we try to make things as simple as we can, that's, if you like, a who, a what, and a why. But from our experiences, and certainly my thinking, the idea that, that's it, we're sorted, we've got a great technique, is it all downhill from here? Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. It's a technique and it gives us a structure, but it's what we do with that structure that is the most important thing. And I'm going to come on to that very shortly. Before I do that, I just want to start off with the first one of our polls, because I want to get some information from you to see where you are in terms of user stories and how you get on with them. So what I'm going to do now is launch a poll for you. So if you can have a look at your screens, you should see something coming on there now that talks about how you're getting on with user stories. Now, it's quite possible you don't use them and you're not quite sure what they are. That's fine. You might have had some goes at it but not doing very well. Maybe that's why you're on the webinar. You might be having some success. In fact, you might be doing extremely well. So if you'd like to fill in those questions and just respond to those, and as I see, most people are starting to get going on it now. And let's have a look and see where we are. Just going to give you another 10 or 15 seconds. We normally give a poll about a minute. It's quite interesting, the results that are coming through already. Most of you have voted now, so I'm going to close the poll and let you have a look at the results. So I've now closed the poll and we'll share the results with you. Okay, now if you have a look on our screen, I think that's quite interesting. First thing I draw your attention to is right down the very bottom. We're doing very well. So 4% are saying, yeah, we're doing really, really well. And that's great. And it'd be interesting to know why you're doing well. And I wonder how many of the tips we go through you might have been adopting, and you might say that's how you've got there. But the big thing that's coming across to me there really is 30% don't actually use them. So that's why people coming onto this webinar are having a look. And it just goes to show you how the adoption of Agile is, at some ends, everybody's been doing it for 5 or 10 years, but so many people are coming to it for the first time. And one of the reasons for this webinar series is to debunk some of this Agile, if you like, hype and mystery, and tell you what these user stories actually are. So the main top answer there was we're having some successes, and I think that is because the user story has some good structure and really does help, as opposed to somebody just writing something on a post-it. We get something a bit more substantial there. So what I'm going to do now is close that and go back to the presentation. This will just take one moment. Because what I want to concentrate on now is something called sausages and GIGO. I appreciate we're getting close to lunch and you might not want me talking about things like dinner, but GIGO stands for garbage in, garbage out. And it's very important that you understand a user story works in the same way as a sausage machine. The fact of the matter is the sausages are as good as the ingredients you actually put into them. So if we're writing not particularly good user stories, what we're going to end up with is not particularly good project, not particularly good requirements, and it's not going to work very well from that point. So what we need to do is get real about what really happens when we actually gather requirements. So when you say to people, I want to know your requirements, what do you want from this project, what do you want from this new product, what do you want from this new system, you get a lot of different answers and different things come at you. So here's a few. I want the project completed for less than 200k. I want it user-friendly. I want it fast and reliable. I want to email the customer when their DVD is dispatched. I want to update a person's contact details. Now this is the sort of thing that hits you when somebody says, I want some requirements. And what I want to just try with the group at the moment and all listening here is to have a look at another poll very quickly to see what you think of those as requirements. And my question for you is this. Out of those 5 you can see on the screen, and there might be more than one correct answer, which of those do you class actually as a requirement? So if I show you the poll now, and you look on your screens, just tick the ones that you believe are correct. You can tick them all, you can only tick one, you can tick none if you like. But out of all those that you see there, what do you think are requirements? Because if we have the user story as the structure and we have some requirements coming in, does that mean problem solved, or have we actually got to be careful what we actually have there? Now the results are coming in and it's looking good. So just a bit more, we're just over 50%. You're voting really quickly today, that's good. So I'm going to maybe draw a line there and see and show you what the results, because again the results are quite interesting. Although I've just had a major technical problem, let me share that with you. Just give me 30 seconds. Okay, now this is why the user story and gathering requirements is quite important, because it's very easy just to say these are requirements. And the first thing I would say is that it's the bottom two that are most like a requirement. For example, it's a function. I want to email a customer when a DVD's dispatched. I want to update a person's name and contact name. Now again, you'd need to write a lot more, and this is only a high-level experiment. But I just want to show you it's the top three that I find quite interesting, because they are also, or certainly the second and third one are also requirements, but they're what are called non-functional. They're very general. You need to get someone to say what they mean by user-friendly. You need to get somebody to say what they mean by fast and reliable. But let's be clear here, the second and third ones are requirements in terms of if you're gathering requirements, you would want to know what they are. Equally, the bottom two are. But the top one is very interesting because that isn't really what I would call a functional or non-functional requirement. It's more a project objective. But if you go to the sponsor and say, what are your requirements? They're going to come up to you and say, I need the project done for less than 200K. So be careful when you're talking to the sponsor. It's no good saying to them, that's not a requirement, by the way, because you're probably going to get quite an icy stare coming back to you. So the point of this poll and this exercise is to show you that requirements come in many shapes and forms, and are we really sure what a requirement is? But again, we can have the user story that can help us in terms of building a better structure for what the requirements look like. So just to get back to the screen, I hope. I'm having a slight technical issue here. Just bear me 1 minute. Ideally, I want to be on the screen. There we go. We're getting a little bit better. Apologise for that. We've got just some slight technical issues, but we're up and running. We're trying to be agile and flexible, and some things go wrong, but let's keep going. So we just have a look at what really happens when people say, want one. We're looking at what actually really happens, and this is the thing that comes out from requirements. So what we need to do is try to clean these requirements, analyze these requirements, and this is where the BA comes in. So the important thing is, how do we get good requirements, and how do we get good user stories? So one of the big things is to stick with, if you like, best practice that's already evolved and it's already there, but just remember it's continually evolving. We don't want to get rid of the experiences in the past and what we've done with other methods like SSADM and the more traditional business analysis approaches. We want to build on those. It's not an either-or. Agile requirements or agile requirement gathering is not a different subject, or we do it in a different way, or we don't have to do what we've done before. A lot of traditional thinking still works. It's just that this user story concept, if you like, has raised the bar. Remember, only a very few people have said how successful they've been with it, but it's because it's a new technique and it's brought something to the party in terms of making things a lot clearer. But the need to excel in this area now, the need to get very good at this and not, if you like, throw away a lot of traditional thinking is really quite important. So how do we get these good requirements? And I'm going to take you through 7 top tips now to show you the sort of things that you need to be looking at. The first thing, and this is why one of the easiest, if you like, jobs on the planet is being a BA, because they just sit there saying why all the time. That's quite an easy thing. A 3-year-old kid could do it. Now, I'm only kidding. I was a BA and I thought it was easy to start with, and it took me quite a few years till I realised how actually hard this job was. And there's a bit more to it than saying why. But in essence, what you're trying to do is get to the real requirements, not just the first impression. I'm sure some of you have heard the story about Henry Ford. If you like, if it had just gone with the first question, the question would have been, I want a faster horse. Nobody's going to say, I want a car. A similar story I know was about cases. A big product development company were trying to make lighter suitcases, but actually what they wanted to make was suitcases that carried more, and that actually resulted in the invention of suitcases with wheels on. So the desire to create lighter suitcases ended with actually heavier suitcases, but the real requirement was met, and I'm sure everybody's got wheels on their suitcases nowadays. So the golden rule number one is keep saying why, get to the real requirement, get to the fundamental of what you're trying to do. Top tip number two is to use this user story structure, but to build on it, to adapt it. Don't just look at a very simple structure that I showed you earlier. Try and add things to it, like acceptance criteria. One of the best things you can do is actually add a series of questions to your requirement to make it make sense so that you know whether you've achieved it. A lot of Agile refer to this as defining done. How do you know something is done? If I gave you an example of something like a plastic cup, how do you know a plastic cup has been built correctly? Now, you could specify it and say it's 2 millimeters thick and it's this color white and it's got a rim of 14 millimeters or whatever, but sometimes it's asking questions that debunk a lot of the, if you like, the spec style of requirements. If you were to ask questions like, can I pick the cup up with hot water in it? That's the sort of thing you need to ask, because it works out whether it actually does what it's supposed to do. Is it fit for purpose? Now, in the Agile space, that's called done. Some people call it acceptance criteria. Some people call it quality criteria if you're coming from a more traditional background. But the key thing is, what questions would you ask with your user story in order to find out whether the requirement has been met? This makes a huge difference, and it also validates the user story. So you can write a user story, it looks okay, but when you ask a load of questions, you suddenly realize whether you actually know what you've actually got. Now, one method that's out there that's quite common, so that's why I'm referencing it here, is something called invest, and that is to make sure every user story is independent, negotiable, of value or valuable, can be estimated or estimable, small or sizable, and testable. Now, I'm not a tremendous fan of invest because I think most of those are sort of semi-redundant or obvious, but it's better than nothing, if you like. What we do at KRC is have, if you like, quality criteria, and it's a series of 10 questions you will ask about your user story. And we find our customers really like this. They prefer it to invest because it actually is a lot more direct in trying to make sure you've got a really good user story. Now, if you're interested in that document, Claire, I think, has loaded it up onto the website as a free download. Maybe more information about that at the end. But as I say, that is a free download for anybody to have a look at, which we call a user story quality criteria. You know, if there was only 3 questions to ask about a user story, what would you ask? And that's what we've created there. So anyone listening to the webinar can take that as a download. So that's top tip number 2. Take the user story structure, but build on it, amplify it, make it a little bit more streetwise. Top tip number 3, and this is the one we find more and more than any other problem, is what we call purity, going for purity and avoid the solution. If somebody comes up to you and gives you the solution in the user story, it's very easy for the technical people just to go and build it. This is why the business analyst needs to keep saying why. It's relatively easy. I know the developers won't appreciate me for saying this, but it's and the engineers. But it's relatively easy to build a solution. It's just actually finding out what the problem is. That's the hard part. Remember the story about the horses and the suitcases. But it's really important to remove anything that looks like a solution. It's convenient just to leave it in there. So we're saying there, don't be lazy. And when you come to something that's, if you like, got the solution in it, strip the solution out, go for a pure requirement, and maybe use a comments field to mention how the solution might look, but don't prejudge it. Because if you tell a developer or an engineer to build it in a certain way, why would they question it? They'll just go and build it. Remember the example you saw earlier about emailing a customer to say their DVD has been dispatched? I don't know how many of people listening at the moment thought that was a particularly okay requirement. It's a very typical requirement. It's the sort of thing we see all day long. But actually it's not a very good requirement at all. That's got the solution in it. The word email is a solution. What the requirement should have said is notify the customer that their DVD has been dispatched. Now, by all means, put in a comments column that it might be an email, but when you talk to the technical people, they might say things to you like, have you thought of using SMS or text? So this is the point about number 3, is to try to go for a pure requirement as possible. Tip number 4 is very much about interaction. This is one thing we also see. the user story can sometimes be very anodyne or very simplistic. The user story is actually defined in the very early days of Agile as what's called a token for a conversation. Now that conversation needs to happen. That's what the whole point is. And tip number 4 from KRC is to say, assess what we call the golden ratio. How much time do you spend writing the user story, and how much time do you spend discussing, interacting, talking about what this thing might be, the conversation? Because the ratio should be of an order of 10 to 90. 90% of your time should be spent in discussion, and the writing should be, if you like, a background task. The writing of it is still hard, but it shouldn't be the main event. And what we often see is we write down a few user stories, yeah, we got them, and off we go. That we find dangerous, and later on it's called scope creep. Tip number 5 is very much about start with the end in mind. Again, this is a classic Agile problem where we have a bunch of user stories in a pile or in a deck or on the wall, and off we go and build it. But what's the project about? What's the end goal? Often this list is called a backlog. Where did the backlog come from? What are we supposed to be achieving here? And this is why we say start with the end in mind, because if you know exactly what the project is about or what your product is about, all of these user stories should map onto it. User stories don't exist in a vacuum. You need to work out what the primary goal is. What are you trying to achieve? And this is where this mapping I referred to, or whether you're using a prioritization technique like Moscow, where does it all end up? And a user story on its own is dangerous, to be honest. It needs to have a context. What exactly are we trying to do with this project? Now, we dealt with that in other webinars, but this, as I say, when we suddenly realize the user story is wrong because it's not quite what the project wanted, it's sort of generally termed, hey, there's scope creep going on. Well, that's not really the user story's fault per se. It's the fact you didn't know what the project was about in the first place. Now, just a quick tip for anyone who might have spotted that a Dyson isn't actually a vacuum cleaner. I have to admit that I was in a workshop at Dyson once, and I did say to everyone in the room, what happens if somebody needs to order a new bag? And that was a slightly embarrassing moment, but I'll just leave that one there if you don't mind. Tip number 6, and this is a really important thing, because remember, 25% of people didn't have a business analyst role, and my guess is a lot of those would be dealing with something called a product owner. Now, product owner is a very big thing in Agile, but it is potentially a disastrous situation if you don't handle it correctly. Now, don't get me wrong, the product owner is very valuable in the Agile space as long as the product owner does what they're capable of doing. A lot of Agile, in fact, focuses on just the PO. A lot of very software-centric techniques, like, for example, Scrum or extreme programming, have a sort of attitude that if you've just got a product owner, everything is fine. Just put your hand on a product owner and everything's fine and dandy. We know what we're doing. But the advice we give you at KRC is exactly how far can the product owner go? How much do they represent different views from the business? How good are they at good old-fashioned business analysis and digging deep into how good the business should be and the process should be? And our advice is to create a partnership between the product owner and the business analyst. The business analyst brings different things to the party. A PO is a different beast to the BA. Now, I'm not saying you can exist with just the BA, but you could. But my worry is, can you exist with just a product owner? If you're in a very product-focused environment with a product owner, maybe. But I do have to say, from all the product owners I walk into and see, this is an incredibly difficult job for someone to do so many things under the umbrella heading of product owner. I've seen some fantastic product owners in my travels, but for every one or two I've seen 25, 30, 50 that really don't have the breadth of the experience to make sure that the product that's been built or the project has the right information. Remember, asking why, getting to what the real requirements is, requires a skill set all in its own right. That is why the standalone BA is such a powerful person and a role to have on the project. And it's why at KRC we just don't think you can underestimate this role. So tip number 7 is really to get the BA more prominent on your projects. Get them, if you like, to be centre stage, to be a pivotal part of any project. I don't mean to elevate them above everyone else and say they're the most important role on the planet, but it's not a sideshow, it's not a walk-on part. You need to be clear what the BA is bringing to the party. One of the main things they're going to do is, if you like, stop the technical people getting, in inverted commas, carried away or solutioneering. The BA needs to get under the skin of the business. Where are we trying to go with this project? And this is why the job title is actually called Business Analyst, because they analyse, and this is the value that they're adding. And often this skill set doesn't come with a traditional, if you like, agile product owner. We've recently been working with a copywriting organisation, and we thought we could write pretty good text, and when you suddenly realise the skill a copywriter brings, it takes it to another level. In the same way, gathering requirements, the business analyst should be able to take this to another level. It is not simply a case of writing the things down and sort of hey-ho, off we go. They need to shape the understanding, because when you shape the understanding, the solution falls out of it. If you haven't understood it properly, you're solving a problem that isn't really there. Now, just a sort of final point to show you how, if you like, on a bad day, and this actually came up in a, I've altered it ever so slightly just to protect the innocent, but not much. This actually came up in a real workshop when we were running, but it just happens to be my favourite all-time user story, and I'm just using this as an example of there's a little bit more to it than meets the eye. But that user story in front of you there actually did come up in a workshop, and with about 20 people in the room, somebody did actually say to me, in all seriousness, Keith, what do you actually think of that? Is that a good one or not? And that was quite a difficult one to answer. But as I say, this is the sort of thing you can see. And using the sausage analogy, if you write something that really doesn't add any value, then you're not adding value. And this is why the business analyst skill set is so useful here, because many an inexperienced product owner might write something like that. Okay, maybe not as basic as that, but it's not as easy as just writing things in there. It's a very tricky, complicated job to do. And like I say, just think sausages. The ingredients you put in, the better it goes in, the more things that come out. Okay, we're just coming towards the end of the webinar now, so I've just got a couple of more slides before I hand you over to Claire. But just if you're interested in asking any questions, I'll try and take as many as I can in the time we've got. So if you just want to think up some at the moment and put them in your chat box that Claire mentioned. Just a couple more slides before we get there. Just want to highlight a couple of, if you like, business analysis training options that we support at KRC. And this depends whether you're going down a sort of diploma route in business analysis, but things like business analysis practice and requirements engineering are pretty serious courses in terms of trying to get you to that diploma level. We've got regular public scheduled courses all over the UK. Apologies to those that are in Europe and abroad, but they're the centres that we're using at the moment. And also, although it's not actually on the screen there, we run an Agile BA workshop, so it's a day really on how to build user stories and go through some of those things we've been talking about, quality criteria in terms of what we can do at KRC. So as I say, we can do a one-day Agile focused user story only version. If you want something a lot more comprehensive, the full Monty if you like, then we recommend going more on the 3-day courses, which are all accredited and have exams at the end as per going forward to the diploma. So in summary, very, very simply, the one thing that hopefully I'm not getting all your I don't know, juices going, but don't forget about the sausages. What you put in is what you get out, and you need someone who's skilled and can actually build these user stories. It's not just a case of putting your hand on a business representative or the customer and off you go. This I think is something an Agile good Agile gets it right, but I think a lot of the fragile Agile has created this, let's just get the user stories and off we go. And I'm finding that the bigger organizations with really good business analysis capability are making much greater success of Agile because they're writing decent requirements. Okay, what we will do now is I will hand you over to Claire, and I will start to have a look at some of the questions we've got coming through. So Claire, over to you.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, just to mention, like I said at the beginning of the webinar, the next webinar we're going to be discussing estimation. That's on October the 12th at 12:30 p.m. once again. We've got a free download for everybody who's joined the webinar today and those that registered. To download your copy of the KRC user story guidelines that Keith mentioned earlier, just visit AgileKRC.com, click on resources on the main tab, and then click on downloads. On that page you'll see all of our current KRC presentations, and today's slide set will be there available to download. And then if you scroll down a bit further to miscellaneous, you're going to see that user story checklist that you can download. So hopefully you will find that helpful. If you do want any more help afterwards, with more help to do with consultancy or training, then do contact us after the webinar and we can certainly help you with that. I've put the next couple of course dates for public courses on there, should anybody be interested in public training. The next requirements engineering course is in London on the 10th of September. The next business analysis practice course is in London on the 15th of October. Again, you can see all of the courses available from KRC on our website. Just click on book a course and you'll see the full course calendar. And also we've put there finally, would you like a visit from the requirements doctor? Keith comes in and does this, but we have lots of other consultants that we can send in, which I'm sure can help you take this to the next level. So I think that's us just about done for today. We'll click on to the next slide so that you've got our contact details if you want to contact us after the webinar. But just want to say thank you for joining us once again, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you.
Claire, can I just stop you there? Are you there?
Yeah.
I've got some questions to answer first.
Oh, of course you have.
Sorry about that.
Keith.
We've got 10 minutes. We're just give me 10 minutes before you'll switch off. So, and then I'll hand you back to Claire to do that again, if you don't mind. Sorry, Claire, to cut across you there. Right. I've got some questions to answer. If you're still on the webinar, I've just looked at the attendees, and we've still. I think just about everybody's here. So I have got quite a few questions, so I'm going to crash through them, and if I don't give you an answer you're happy with, get an email across to Claire and we'll try and do a little bit more there. Okay. First question then from Paul, can you tell me the difference between use cases and user stories? Where do they fit together? Slightly controversial area that. There is actually some pretty interesting stuff by Alistair Coburn. He's a very well-known Agile guy, and he talks about those two being similar, a bit like a gazebo is like a gazelle. It's a slightly abstract lot of information there, but in simple terms, a use case is just, if you like, one single requirement, one function or one non-function. A user story is one function or a non-function, but a use case is more a scenario, a process, a sequence, a series of interactions, and I find the two can coexist quite happily. You don't need to use both. If you've got enough information with user stories and some other modeling technique, you don't need use cases. Use cases have got to be applied correctly. In the modeling webinar we talked a lot about use cases, and if you can write good ones and everybody understands them, then it's a very good way of driving out a high-level understanding of the situation. But as I say, if you want to type into your Google the things like gazebo and gazelle, I think you'll find some pretty good stuff on there. But there are overlaps and there are nuances. But as I say, a user story is more granular, and a use case is a lot more like if you like, a scenario or a system interaction. I've got something from Don here. What level of documentation do you feel is appropriate for user stories? Perhaps depends on the organisation culture. I'm particularly thinking of organisations that demand more governance and documentation. Now, this is the classic case of how much governance and how much documentation do you need? And what at KRC we try to get you to do is use the right level of governance for the conditions. I often use the analogy of driving a car. You use the right gear to go up a hill. A steep hill, you'd use a different gear to a very gradual hill. And in the same way, in terms of the documentation, there's going to be projects that you can run with user stories written on index cards that have got magnets on a whiteboard, and everything is fine. It's fit for purpose. You can photograph it in order to keep a record of it. But if you're building the Olympic Stadium, that might not be the best way to go. You don't really want to find a user story down the back of the radiator or something. So with levels of governance, if you're working on, say, a military project, you might need to formally write these down in, say, an Excel spreadsheet or even a proprietary vendor tool like Doors. But this might sound like a cop-out, but it really is the right answer. The level of documentation you need is whatever is appropriate, is safe, and everybody's happy with. But I wouldn't wrap loads of things in lots and lots of governance just because that's what you're told to do on every project. I can assure you I've seen some extremely high-cost projects that have run quite happily with a lot of big pieces of paper on a sticky wall, and it was safe as houses. Some other governance issues and control and project definitions and business cases, maybe that was written in other documentation elsewhere, but there is nothing wrong per se with low-tech user stories, and in fact I would say that is one of the big Agile advantages, that we don't get hung up on just bureaucracy. It's trying to debunk it. An expression I often use is lean documentation, but I use the word lean as opposed to zero. If you're running quite a complicated project with just a bunch of user stories, that might actually be quite dangerous. So sorry, Don, I've got to give you a slightly vague answer, but it is the right answer. You drive to the conditions and you make sure that, for example, your steering group are okay with your level of documentation. A question from Jane here: do the Scrum developers get involved in the initial analysis with the BA? Now I really like this question, because this is where, if we take Agile as it's grown, or pure Agile, the fact is that a Scrum developer is just a role. They're just part of the team. There's no reason why you couldn't have a BA in the actual Scrum team. So it depends how you build your Scrum teams. If you've got a BA in it, then it's just job done. But the sort of perception is there's just a bunch of developers and they're working with index cards and user stories, and off they go. And the BA is a little bit more peripheral. In fact, we don't even need them. So in terms of do the Scrum developers get involved in the initial analysis of the BA? It kind of depends how you see the BA and how you've rolled out Scrum. In pure Scrum, and in fact in most manifestations of Scrum, there is no BA role. That's the key thing everybody sort of listens to this webinar really needs to look at. It's the PO, the product owner, that does all that work. But I find in a real world, and when you scale up Agile, getting the BA on board and working with the PO is just, to me, absolute common sense and worth its weight in gold. So hopefully, Jan, I've answered that question there. I've got a question here from Chantal saying, is there a recommended way of documenting user stories and linking them to a functional spec? Now, the interesting thing with that question is it's a little bit like oil and water. Functional spec is very old traditional waterfall, and the user story comes across as this slightly anarchic, funky, agile way of working. But it's similar to the previous question, that user story is really just a way of capturing a requirement. There's no magic to it. It's a good structure. I think the idea of making somebody say, what the role is and what the benefit is, and putting quality criteria on it is really good. And therefore linking it to some other documentation, either by a reference number. But a functional spec is a lot more formal. In Agile, you're trying to go with more a high-level specification. That doesn't mean vague. It just means you don't start off in the very early stages of a project with a detailed functional specification. Now, that might be mandated or forced upon you, in which case, okay. Then when it gets granular, you get down into the smaller detail. And one thing we try to teach our customers at KRC is what we call boulders, rocks and gravel. So when you're generating requirements in the early day, they're going to be very big. They're going to be like boulders. You can then break them down into rocks, and you then break them down into gravel. Now, an agile term for user story here is epic. Epic relates to the boulder. A user story relates to, if you like, the rocks, and the gravel is when you get down to tasks and more specific stuff. So there's no reason why you couldn't give reference numbers there and link them back to a functional spec if you're actually forced to, you're supposed to use those, or that happens to be mandated. Question from Nikki regarding tip number 7. Regarding moving the BA Centerstage, whose responsibility do you see that being? That's quite a tricky question to answer, because if I was a project manager on a project and I was missing a BA, I'd go and try and get one. But I think it's more a process type question. So your project office, project management office, PMO, PSO, whatever, somebody really should be saying, what are the roles and responsibilities on a project? Who should be there? Who shouldn't be there? If you've got an organisation where, and this happens, and we spend a lot of time not necessarily correcting this, but trying to improve it, where you've just got the pure technical people and one product owner, we spend time trying to educate and train to move the BA into this area. So invariably we're working with the sponsor of the Agile rollout or the project management office. So whose responsibility is it? I think it's almost the organisation or the people looking after the process, the guardians of your project and product process, that need to be embraced and liaised with to find out whether there's some traction there. And trust me, you occasionally get some situations where we don't need a BA. Why do we need a BA? We're all pretty bright here. We know the product inside out. We don't need a BA. So you can sometimes get some cultural type situations there. But as I say, if you're in flight, I'd say it's the project manager. If you're talking about a more wider situation about where you move your organisation, you then need to look at your sponsors for change and the people looking after the process. As I say, people like PMO. And how do you deal? Question from Jane: how do you deal with dependencies and hierarchies? How do you, how deep do you go? That's also a very interesting question, because again, I have to be slightly, what's the word? It sounds like a cop-out here, but you need to go as deep as you need to go. And what I'm more specifically saying is, early on in the project, don't go anything below high-level requirements. As you then evolve, this is a standard Agile thing. The devil's in the detail. Let the detail come out later. You don't want to be going for detail at an early stage, mainly because you won't know the detail early on, and it will take you a lot of time. Now, bear in mind, 30% of people don't use user stories and are maybe new to Agile. This is one of the big changes in Agile, is to understand that the detail comes out later and evolves later. But one thing I would say about the dependencies question is, a lot of people think you can get 35, 50 user stories all in a row and just prioritize them 1 to 50 and just start working on the most important one. This doesn't work in the real world, and even now I think a lot of the Scrum community are changing to what's called order as opposed to priority. A simple example is, you can't start with the roof of a house, even though it might be the most important. And the way I would actually do dependencies is very much in a graphical way. A lot of people I see use reference numbers on the story cards, but I don't find that as clear and intuitive. I'd much rather you actually put the user stories in some sort of sequence, or support it with some form of model. So the model could be a use case, it could be a low-tech model drawn in Visio. The project team or the product team normally knows and has a good feel of what the dependencies are, but I can't. I just think it's a great idea to map it out and show it visually. So that's how I would handle dependencies and hierarchies. When we do on our training courses, we often do a time box or sprint planning session, and I might be giving away a secret here, but the one thing we don't do is tell people how to do it. So our trainers normally say, we want you to come up with a plan, but we're not going to tell you the things you need to know yet. And people look a bit confused. But what actually happens is, people look at hierarchies, natural groupings, they look at natural dependencies, and the thing just falls out. But as I say, how deep do you go? You go as deep as you need to. Too much information can blind you from where you're actually going. You just need enough information and no more. Again, this it's a saying we use a lot. Just enough information and no more. Right, I'm coming to the end of the time. There are, I have to say, quite a few questions we've not got to, and as part of these webinars, we will answer them and we'll get going on the answer. Whether you'll get it today or in the next 48 hours, if you could just cut us a little bit of slack on that. I'm off abroad this afternoon, so all I can say is we will get you the answers to any questions we haven't answered. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. I've just got a message from Claire on the chat line saying no need to hand back because Claire's already done her handover. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation. I hope you're having some nice sunny weather because we seemed in the UK to have had a slightly odd summer. And as I say, we're here to help you. If you want to get in touch, use those downloads. As I say, we're very keen. We're a different company. We don't just do the same old, but please get in touch if we can help you. Enjoy your lunch. Let me know if you happen to have sausages, but this is Keith Richards saying bye for now.